Hi, everyone. I'm Bud Mishkin, and welcome to a night of conversation for the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene. And it is my pleasure to be in conversation tonight with one of the great New Yorkers and one of the great conversationalists, shall we say, in New York. Multi-Tony Award winner, the Broadway producer and friend, Manny Azenberg. Manny, how are you tonight?
I'm the oldest I've ever been.
Nice. Me too. So we have something in common there.
But it's the contemporary virus.
Yeah. The National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene. Tell me about growing up in your home. Was Yiddish spoken?
Yes. My parents spoke Yiddish when my sister and I wouldn't, so we shouldn't understand. Then we learned a lot, and then they spoke Polish so we shouldn't understand. But I also went to a labor Zionist camp for my first 20 years of my life. Unser Camp and Kinderwelt, Yiddish Nationale Arbeiterverband. And so we grew up in a definitively labor Zionist Jewish home.
So at what age did you kind of start picking up Yiddish and realize you could understand it?
My father wanted me to learn Yiddish, but between Hebrew school, Yiddish, and piano lessons, and I wanted to play stickball. So I was intensively educated until I was bar mitzvahed, and then I rebelled.
Yeah.
Stickball won, and I was wrong. I should have stuck with it.
Stickball.
But at Unser Camp in Kinderwelt, people spoke Yiddish. Those are European immigrants, and we were first generation Americans, and Yiddish was heard everywhere.
Was there a lot of talk? Was there a lot of talk in your house about the Yiddish theater?
My uncle, my father's brother, was an actor in the Yiddish theater. His name was Wolf Barzel. Barzel in Hebrew is the same thing as Azenberg. And he, of course, spoke Yiddish, and he also was on Broadway. That's where we got our initiation into the theater.
How did that transition go from being in the Yiddish theater to being on Broadway?
Everybody in the Yiddish theater wanted to be in the English theater,
right?
And some actually made it. Paul Muni, for example, and even Jerry Robbins. And my uncle was in a play with John Garfield called Skipper Next to God.
Mm-hmm.
And we went down from the Bronx to Broadway. And we went backstage to see John Garfield, who was the Marlon Brando of Bronx kids. And there was a big star on his #1 dressing room, and it was a Jewish star. And Kinderwelt, Children's World. And there are a lot of people came out of those camps.
You've talked to me.
Sidney Lumet, for example. His father was an actor in the camp, and there were a number of people who went into the theater from Kinderwelt.
Now, of course, we know you from behind the scenes as a producer, longtime producer on Broadway. But as you're growing up, both at camp and then at the Bronx High School of Science, are there moments where you want to be on stage? And did you indeed get on stage?
Yes, but when I went into the Army, I got rid of that idea. The idea of coming, I was an infantry officer. So when I came back, the idea of walking around with your picture to various agents had no dignity. So I gave it up.
Prior to the Army, had that been a possibility that you wanted to?
It was a fantasy.
Yeah.
You know, when you're in college, you have all sorts of fantasies about what you're going to do. I think my father went into mourning when I told him I was interested in the theater. But
did you do any shows?
When I came out, I was not. It was less important. I was older, and
you stopped broadcasting.
And I had. I've been with a real unit, and life was a little different, and I dealt with it a little bit more seriously.
I'm told that there is a technical problem.
Stop broadcasting at 3 minutes.
So Hold on one second. Per, come here. We're gonna get some technical help here. Come here.
Tell me how I can help.
Here, call that number, 617. Rumor has it we are not
Hey,
on.
you're still live.
We
You're
are
good.
still live.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
Sorry
still
about
alive.
that.
Tony,
Forgive me,
thank you, Tony. Per,
Yeah.
I'll take the phone back.
forgive me.
That's why it's live.
People are writing that they can't see. the
All right.
video and I can't get you on.
Just when we were getting to the good part.
Apparently, there's been some technical issue that some people are not being able to watch this, which is unfortunate. So the connection to Yiddish. Also, so you were at NYU. Did you do shows while you were at NYU?
Yes. Yes, I was a college actor. And I don't really regret it. I have really no complaint. It turned out I wound up doing something that I paid attention to, which was more satisfactory.
Mm-hmm. Rumor has it that also when you were at NYU, you were an usher at television shows. Is this
Yes,
correct? Or is this...
No, I did that. We did that for money, but
Yeah.
We got $2.50 per show. But if you were the head usher, you got an extra 50 cents. And if you hooked the tickets on 48th Street and Broadway, you got an extra $1. And if we did 3 or 4 of those in a week, you had enough for a date on the weekend. And you got $1 an hour for telethons. You remember telethons? They would go for 24 hours.
Sure.
Well, if you worked a telethon, you got $24.
You were just kind of starting your career in the early and mid 60s. Now, the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene, one of the great things it did recently, or of recent ilk, is the Yiddish production of Fiddler on the Roof with Joel Grey directing, and it was a beautiful, beautiful production. Can you recall in the early and mid 60s when does word start to circulate that this show about the Eastern European shtetl experience, ostensibly, is going to happen? Do you recall, was like the word of mouth starting to happen? And was there any question or concern of, is a show with such an seemingly explicit Jewish theme, will it play? Okay, well, it's sometimes the lights in the theater go out and you got to start the show all over again. So, but we won't start to tell all those stories again. But
no, Fiddler. You asked about Fiddler. Fiddler was an enormous success from the get-go, and it transcended. We Jews are proprietary, and we think it's us, but that show transcends everybody. It's a big hit in Burma,
right,
and it's a big hit in Tokyo, and its fundamentals are universal.
So in those first years when you're working as a company manager, is the feeling like, yeah, this is great, I'm in the theater, it's what I want to do, it's happening for me? Or is there any sense of, I don't know, is there any plan B at that moment?
The truthful answer is there wasn't. I was very happy doing what I was doing.
Right.
And one thing sort of led to another. I suppose that I was competent at what I was doing. So I worked for David Merrick for 3 or 4 years and did 17 Broadway shows. So you learned your trade. And then Gene Walsk and I left Merrick and we produced on our own. Gene wanted to produce, I would general manage, but we wound up doing it together. And we did The Lion in Winter, and we did a play about Auschwitz, The Investigation, and Hal Holbrook's Mark Twain, and a black show called Ain't Supposed to Die a Natural Death, and the rest is a minor history.
So the first one is The Lion in Winter.
Yes.
Did you know what you were doing?
No.
Okay.
No. The honest answer is, I think when I think about it, I ask very naive questions.
Right.
The management of it, I understood. The aesthetics, I had to learn. And that took a while. And then I got it.
And where in this chronology does the famed story of you being able to smoothly field a ground ball in the Broadway show league
Well,
lead to your connection to Neil Simon?
That started in 1962. I had played with Robert Redford in 1959. We were on the same team. Redford played first base. I was the shortstop. And Redford came back to New York in 1962 with Barefoot in the Park, the Neil Simon comedy, and it was Neil's first really big hit. And Redford called up and said, "Do you have to play on our team?" So I played shortstop, and Neil Simon played second base, and Redford played first base. And the rest is sort of history. It wasn't right away. It was 7 years later that Neil called up and said, and I had done a few things by then, called up and said, would you like to produce my plays? And I remember being somewhat cavalier and said, I don't know, let me think about it. But he was serious. But the tragic story is that he had found out that his first wife had metastasized breast cancer and was going to die. And they were clearing the decks for anything that made them unhappy. And she did die a year later. And that was the Sunshine Boys.
Right.
And that was successful. And then we did about 22 more over the next 30, 40 years.
In 1988 or 89, at the Broadway Show League, softball league, when you were still playing, I may have asked you one of the dumber questions I've ever asked, and I've asked more than a few. What kind of player was Redford? And you were ready and said,
he's a natural.
There you go. There you go.
And he was. No, he was. He was. If you watch the movie and you know anything about baseball, his swing, good left-handed swing, he could drill the ball. And he was a good football player too, and he's a very good tennis player. So,
well, rumor has it you were no slouch on the field either. You're a pretty good ball player.
I in those days I thought it was the one thing I was confident about. The rest of my life has been a little shaky.
Do you know any other Broadway producers who had a Louisville Slugger in their office with their name on the bat?
True.
It's pretty good.
And it was a good menacing piece of equipment. And we negotiate.
Negotiating tactic, yeah.
Negotiating would go very quickly.
You once said to me that as you grow more comfortable as a producer, you learn to say less, not more. Did you find that out from a particular instance, or just something that you kind of started to intuitively get along the way?
When we did the real thing, the Tom Stoppard play, Stoppard is a genius and he's brilliant.
We're getting to him.
Well, I didn't want my opinion asked. You don't trust your opinion. These are subjective issues. So I was hiding in the thing. There's a tap on my shoulder, and it was Stoppard. And he said, "What do you think?" And I blurted out viscerally. 10 minutes into the second act, I wasn't paying attention. I was looking at the scenery. And he nodded his head and said, okay, and came back 5 days later and said, is it better? And it's the major lesson that don't tell them what to write. Tell them whether you're engaged or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that don't intrude in a real artist's effort. You don't know where the motivations come from. You don't know where the characters come from. You don't know what his life or her life experience is. So you don't tell them how to write. And that worked. It doesn't mean you don't have a sensibility. You just don't assume the creativity. It's not yours.
As a younger producer, was that a trap that you had already fallen into?
No, I was more frightened, so I didn't say anything. And then more with Neil, it was easier because we came from the same neighborhood. We're all from Neil was from Washington Heights and I was from the Bronx, and we knew who these characters were. So, for example, when we did Broadway Bound, 2 or 3 weeks before rehearsals, we had a reading, and the big scene in that play is the mother dancing with the son.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't in the show. And we had dinner after the reading, and Neil said, "What did you think?" And I said, "I missed the mother in the second act." And he nodded his head and he said, "Give me a couple of weeks." And in 3 days, he wrote the scene that made the play. And you could not have imagined that a scene, he's the only one in the world who could have written that scene. It all comes out of his experience.
Right.
And so you don't intrude in that process.
Do you think that as much as you know about the process today, do you think that's something that producers who are not just producers in this from the standpoint of contributing a decent amount of money, but actually involved in the process, do you think they are more involved than that? Or does that kind of truism still stand today?
The good ones will not intrude in if you're dealing with a real artist. What are you going to tell Sondheim what lyric to write? Think about it.
Yeah.
And think about what bullet you want in your brain. You don't intrude in that, but you have the right to say, "I'm not engaged," because that's genuine for you. You're not, you know what I mean?
Right.
You're giving an honest, visceral response.
Yeah.
And remember, you chose to do this project. So the glitches you're allowed to talk about, but not tell them what to write.
You told me once that once you make a stupid comment to a playwright, the curtain comes down.
Yes. Then they'll be defensive because you're not trustworthy.
And never look at you the same way ever again? Or will there be some notion of, okay, you said that once.
Then they won't ask you your opinion. They won't trust you. It's like telling somebody their baby is ugly.
Right.
You don't do that. You have to know that this work, they're serious people. The playwrights are serious people. These are major efforts, and there's a certain amount of diplomacy. Also, there's when we did a play called God's Favorite with Neil would take out, you'd have to wait a week or two when you take out some of the product jokes or the bad lines, and don't bring it up because it wastes time. So there was a line in it about hemorrhoids. And after 2 weeks, it stayed in the play. And I went over to Neil and said, "Neil, hemorrhoids?" And he said, "Don't you think I know? I don't have anything better." You have to know that.
Right.
So when you say this is no good, well, what will replace it? And until the playwright knows what will replace it, it fills a stopgap. You have to be able to make those judgments. Also, it would be nice to know who you're working with. So Neil, we were friends. And Stoppard and I became friends. Took a while.
You talked to me recently about his most recent show and going to London. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Well, for the Folksbiene, it's a masterwork. Tom Stoppard is now 82 years old, and his life story is fascinating. And he was born in Czechoslovakia. And his father and mother were Jews, secular Jews, and his father was a doctor. And the head of the shoe factory that he was working in said, "Get out of here, the Nazis are coming." And the Stoppard family went to Singapore,
Wow.
where the father had a job. But the Japanese were coming, so the mother and Tom and his brother went to India, and they never saw the father again. Many years later, 5 or 6 years later, the mother remarried Major Stoppard of the British Army, And Stoppard grew up as a English schoolboy. To cut a long story short, because he became well known and he went back to Czechoslovakia, to the Czech Republic, because he was friendly with Václav Havel, who was the president and also a playwright.
Mhm.
And he began to bump into people who knew his parents and his grandparents.
Wow.
And at age 60 something, he began to make an inquiry. Also, he found out that his father died. There was one survivor of a freighter torpedoed by the Japanese, and that's how the father died. But the mother had a number of sisters that died in Auschwitz. And then he discovered that his grandparents, who were Orthodox Jews on both sides, and they all died in Auschwitz and Treblinka, and they were survivors. And so Stoppard, late in life, has discovered that he's a Jew. And he's written this play, which is about the ghetto in Vienna, Leopoldstadt, which was the Viennese ghetto. And the people that came out of that ghetto are Herzl, Freud, Adler, Mahler, Schoenberg, Billy Wilder, Fritz Lang, and you can go on and on.
Mhm.
And he's written a play about that Viennese ghetto. And also in the end of the play, he comes out definitively as to, I'm a Jew. And it's a very, very moving, magnificent play. I will try to come out of retirement to participate. It's that good. It has 40 people in it. It takes place a number of generations from 1900 to 1955, post-war. And it's called Leopoldstadt. You can all look it up on the Wikipedia. It's a historical place.
How did you first meet him?
I was in London. I was doing some shows with Mike Nichols. I know it's name dropping, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
Mike said, go see a play called The Real Thing. I said, I saw it, Mike. We're not doing it. And the upshot of it was other people were interested in doing it. But then Frank Rich went to London, was writing for the Times, and wrote a bad notice. And everybody went away. And Mike and I were the only ones left interested. And that was almost 40 years ago, and we've been friends. We did the film of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and another play, and it's been a very satisfactory relationship. He's a giant, and I'm respectful.
I know how fond you are of him, not just as a playwright, but as a man. Is he aware of your abilities, of how well you field the ground ball at shortstop? And did that mean anything to
He
him?
was a witness. There is if anyone is interested, you look up the New York Times, I think in 1984, when the Brighton Beach Memoirs played in the finals against The Real George. Sunday in the Park with George, The Real Thing, all the shows were mine. And Stoppard and Sondheim came to watch the game, and Neil Simon.
Yeah.
And Brighton Beach won, but we all celebrated together.
And your statistics from that day?
I went 1 for 4, hit a double into right center field.
Nice. Couple of loud outs, though.
I don't remember that. I don't remember the bad ones. I only remember the good ones.
Okay. Would you like to see the footage?
Well, there was a picture in the Times which we have blown up, and it occupies a wall in our house.
While we're on the sports theme, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of, and this is journalism, purely unbiased opinion, the greatest NBA team of all time, the 1969-70 Knicks. All kidding aside, you've had a long connection to Senator Bill Bradley. Can you tell me about, I assume you were a fan at that point, and the connection to Senator Bradley?
Well, it was a period of time when I worked at the Garden in 1969, and where I met Bradley and DeBusschere and Red Holston.
Wait, you say you worked at the Garden. What?
I left the theater. I was recruited, and they actually paid you. You had real money. You got, and I was only there for 7 or 8 months because the intent was that the Garden was going to become the entertainment center of the world,
Right.
and I didn't think that was really going to happen. So I left and went back to the theater. But there was Red Holtzman, and for the Folksbiene people, he's a Pintalayid. And you'll notice how many wins he has and this banner at the Garden.
Mhm.
600 and how much? 13, I think. That's how many mitzvot there are.
As my grandfather would say.
He would be the first one to tell you.
Yeah. 613.
So it was an eventful period where Bradley is a class act. You know, he should have been the president of the country, but that's an opinion. And we've been friendly since. And you're going to interview him sometime this week.
Sunday night. Thank you for the plug. I appreciate that. So, under the heading of not giving specific advice to a playwright, can I imagine also perhaps not advising Bill Bradley on his jump shot? Probably was not part of your job during your short tenure at Madison Square Garden.
Are you crazy? You know how big those guys are? They'll kill you.
Yeah.
Playwrights will deal with you intellectually, but this guy 6'6" will beat you up.
Yeah. We're going to switch around a little bit in terms of chronology. In 1947, you once told me about the scene in your house or apartment as the UN vote is being taken on the Declaration of the State of Israel. You're what? You're 13 years old at that point, right?
Yeah. It's when Israel became a state.
Right.
What was recognized at the UN, the vote at the UN. My father was an ardent Zionist. And I don't know a better word than ardent, but it defined his life. And so we sat in the kitchen when the UN voted, and it was on the radio. And as they voted, he checked off the countries as they voted. It was arranged so when the United States voted, that was it. And he put the pencil down and said, and I'm only 13, he said, it happened in my lifetime. You know, L'Shana Haba b'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem, it happened in his lifetime, and it was his dream. And it wasn't arbitrary. That we have enough information. We met Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of Israel, before he went to see Harry Truman, just my sister and I. And my father was a friend of his. And so we continued. The word in Yiddish or in Hebrew is hemshech. It means continuity. And so we make these trips to Israel with theater people, or we did up until this year, for the last 30 years.
Right. When did those trips start, and what was the origin of the first trip?
It's if you look it up, Woody Allen wrote a piece, op-ed piece in the Times condemning Israel during the second Intifada. And when asked if he'd been to Israel, he said, "Why should I go to Israel when I can go to Sweden?" So at some meeting with the cultural attaché of Israel, we got into a conversation of anti-Semitism among the Semites and the preconceptions that the world sees as of a Jew, including what the Jews see as Jews. And I said, you can shatter that by going to Israel, and you see the F-16 fighter pilot is Jewish, and also that not all of the Arabs look like Arafat. Right. So we started bringing people to Israel just for that purpose, no proselytizing, neither politically nor religiously. And it seemed to work. And I think it would be safe to say that we wound up with about 600 people over the years. And whereas they may not be Zionists, they're much more knowledgeable about how complicated the Middle East issues are.
Complicated is the right word, that's for sure. Have the trips kind of transformed through the years or changed, or have they pretty much been the same since you started them?
I would say that we always had speakers who would, and the speakers in those some days included Shimon Peres and Bibi Netanyahu and Arabs and plain old passionate people who lived on kibbutzim.
Mhm.
And you humanized the situation rather than politicized it, that these are people living here. And also the extraordinary achievement of that, what has happened in 70 years in Israel, what taking in people from the Middle East and from Europe after the war,
Right.
and what they've achieved is extraordinary. It's extraordinary.
You've told me before about going to the theater as a kid, and that it often meant something. It was when you went to see Death of a Salesman, this was not just for a fun day at the theater, but this had meaning. You put it more eloquently than I am right now. Is there a first show where it really dawns on you, oh, wait a minute, this is not just about we're going to go downtown and go to the theater district and see this fun show, but this was kind of a learning experience as well?
I think you went to the theater for revelation. We didn't go for entertainment. So when I was 14 years old when I saw Death of a Salesman. I had no idea what the American dream was and all the philosophical things. And I remember thinking that I had been to some extraordinary experience as a kid. Maybe it was Fathers and Sons. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I was always respectful after that. And you put a jacket on when you went to the theater, and you didn't eat food, and you didn't have sippy cups with drinks. So I think it was different than a theme park,
right?
Which I think is much more now.
So, but of recent ilk, you've had a connection to a little show called Hamilton, which has made its imprint on the culture. With something like Hamilton, with something like Dear Evan Hansen, do you think that that feeling that you got as a 14-year-old, do you think that as a rule in the theater, or is it more of the exception?
No, I think it's more of the exception. There are fewer plays and more musicals for one, and some of them are flat out entertainment, and some of that is okay. There's nothing wrong with Lion King. I mean, it's terrific. The fellow who produced Hamilton, Jeffrey Seller, who was a friend, he is respectful of the process. Neil Simon has a line in a play where the grandfather tells the two young writers, remember, it's got to be about something. And Hamilton is about something. It's about a lot of things. And the fact that they came up with an idea of doing a musical, a rap musical about Hamilton to be played in all the founding fathers, to be played by African Americans, it's genius afterwards. If they would have announced it, people would have run away from the theater. And look what happened. So, and Jeffrey produced it, and I give him, he's got that sensibility. So does Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Absolutely. Ragtime is also about something. and you did a production in 2009, which was a wonderful production, and it closed pretty soon.
Yes.
And I remember at that time, you were down about it. My question is, when something like that happens, is that a learning experience as well? Do you learn from the shows that you just kind of shake your head and go, how is that possible that this is not hitting? Or is that just the notion of that's the theater, and if you try and figure it out, well, then you're just, you're wasting time.
I think there's for us, and I'm talking about my wife and I, in the same year, we did a good production of Ragtime and a good production of Brighton Beach, revivals both, and they didn't work. And they didn't work not because they weren't good, because the conclusion is that I've had 20, 30 years of my taste seemed to work on Broadway, or at least often enough. And then two shows that I really liked work, so it was time for me to stop. It was expensive. It's personally expensive. You go with the winners, and that's nice. And the losers hurt. But I was old enough to deal with it.
We have some questions.
The theater is not a winner all the time. If you look at all the shows, I think I have a good percentage of successes, but they didn't work.
There's a great story that you've told me, and understanding that whole notion of, as you grow as a producer, the idea of less is more comes into play. But you've told me a story about the show Move Chicago on opening night, and it was a struggle, apparently. Can you tell us what that was all about and what you felt your role was at that moment?
Moving Out wound up to be a success, but it wasn't a success when we opened in Chicago. And the fundamental was, it was a little complicated. And in a conversation with Twyla Tharp, who was the director, I invoked Jerry Robbins' opening numbers. Fiddler is tradition, West Side Story is the big dance number, Forum is Funny Thing Happened on the Way, Comedy Tonight. So Robbins always sent a message in the beginning of the show that this is what you're going to see. You're not going to see a tragedy, you're going to see comedy tonight. You're going to see a dance show. You're going to see a show about tradition. That lets the audience off the hook. They take a deep breath and they go, oh, good, okay. Neil Simon would do the same thing. He said, I have to make them laugh early so they can relax. Well, we didn't have that in Moving Out. And ultimately, not because of my influence, but because of a designer who went up to Twyla and suggested that she introduced the four major characters in the opening number. And she did. And it worked.
But you also used the expression, at least according to you, unless you're misquoting yourself, nobody leaves the canoe.
Well, there are a number of producers, and there was something we used to call flop sweat. and everybody was frightened because they spent a lot of money on that show. And when we opened, it didn't look that good, and the audience was baffled. But being the older man in the group, I sat down and I said, nobody leaves the canoe. Now you go to work. That's why you came here, and we will be supportive.
Flop sweat is the reaction of every audience that's ever watched me, quote unquote, act in a play or musical during my acting career. Not me getting the flop sweat, it's people watching. They're the ones that get the flop sweat. I am not checking my phone here. I am checking questions that have been submitted by the audience, and you can submit your questions. We'll do about 15 more minutes. The question comes, if your career in entertainment did not work out, what job do you think you would have right now? The ultimate plan B question.
Oh, what job?
Had for whatever reason theater not worked, was there some other, do you want to become a microbiologist?
No, no.
Okay, so we can check that one off.
I don't think I had any other ambition. It's not that I was possessed by working in the theater. I think I could have functioned managerially in a lot of places and made a living. Remember what the mandate when we were kids in the Bronx? My father was not interested in my fulfilling myself vocationally. Your obligation was to earn a living and put food on the table, to use those expressions, and pay the rent and make sure your kids went to school. So I suppose I would have had a job, and if I would make it up, but it wouldn't be true. I didn't have any other ambition.
What neighborhood in the Bronx were you from?
156th Street and Walton Avenue.
Right.
But that was after 156th Street and the Grand Concourse.
All right. Were you a Yankee fan?
You had to be, or else you would be assassinated. We were 4 blocks from the stadium.
Yeah. You could have been a Giant fan and could have crossed over the bridge and,
No, there's a street named with the name Azenberg on it now in the Bronx. And it's a kind of a highlight, because when it was my son pulled the curtain to, and it was about 4 blocks from where we grew up. And I thought, if my father saw the name Azenberg somewhere on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, it would be good.
I'm assuming it was for you, for Manny Azenberg.
Yes, but it's his name.
Okay. All right. All right. Some other questions from people who are watching. What was the Neil Simon play that touched you personally the most?
That one I have an answer for.
Okay.
The one that touched me the most was the first one, because it was successful. The one that emotionally touched me was the Brighton Beach, the trilogy.
Right.
And Broadway Bound, which I think there are those who say that The Lost in Yonkers is his best play, but my favorite was Broadway Bound. And it was about the similar neighborhoods. It was set in Brooklyn, but it was a Bronx tale.
Mm. Lost in Yonkers once was the example you gave me about how when you start talking about to a playwright about this might be changed or this, you said you're intruding on something mysterious, which I always thought was
Lost in Yonkers was originally entitled Louie the Gangster. And it evolved into a play about a woman. Now, if you look carefully at all of Neil Simon's plays, you don't see very often the in-depth character being a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out to be about a woman who was slightly impaired and a grandmother. The woman who's slightly impaired, I do not have any understanding of where this character came from. The grandmother was his mother-in-law, but only vaguely.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't give notes. This was a real creation of his. Very often I knew where the motivations came from, where the characters came from. Remember, there are 2 boys in a lot of plays.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Neil and his brother.
Right.
And they show up a lot. But this one came from nowhere, and it won the Pulitzer Prize and the Tony as well.
Through the years, any particular show that you produced either a Stoppard show or a Neil Simon show or the other shows that privately, only to your loved ones, and maybe not even to them, or maybe not even to yourself, or maybe just to yourself, you said, no, this one's not going to work. And then
Yeah, there were a few. There are a few you don't start out that way. You start out thinking, even if you're deluding yourself, you think it can be successful. But at some point, you wake up at 3:00 in the morning and realize, uh-oh. The biggest one would be the musical The Goodbye Girl, which I knew in rehearsal we had made a mistake, but it's one of those issues that you don't leave the ship in the middle.
Right.
You stick it out. And then I did a play once about the Donner Pass and cannibalism. Well, I thought it was good. I did a play called Einstein and the Polar Bear. Ran a few nights. Somebody said to me, how could you do that? And I said, do you think I did it because I hated it?
Yeah, right.
I liked it.
Yeah.
It said something to me. And the fact that it said something to nobody else is dawned on me too late.
Yeah.
I don't regret too many of them, though. They were not done. There were 2 or 3 that I did because other people thought it was good.
Right.
And it didn't work.
The Donner Pass show, can I imagine that the expression, the feel-good hit of the summer, was not used in its promotion?
It didn't run long enough to even promote it.
Yeah, it wouldn't even get to the summer. A couple more questions from our audience. What advice do you have for theater artists during this pandemic?
Patience.
Mm.
Because I don't think until they take mortality out of the equation, the theater won't come back. And so we need a vaccine, or we need something that assures you you're not going to die.
Mm.
You don't want to go, you don't want to risk that. And the theater and athletics and the garden and football are all going to have to wait until this goes away.
Right.
Or is cured. And don't be impatient.
Right. Another question. The architectural landscape of Times Square and Broadway has changed since you began your career. Any particular place or hangout you miss that's no longer there? I believe I know the answer to this question. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. There's the Polish Tea Room.
Right.
There was a wonderful coffee shop that was run by 2 Holocaust survivors. And it was a hangout. The cabbage soup, kapusta, was terrific. Beef barley soup, knedlach were terrific. And these people had survived the Holocaust. Mike Nichols would go there, Neil Simon would go there, the Schuberts would go there. On Wednesday afternoon, magicians would be in the back showing each other tricks. And there was a great hangout. There were also others. There were many others. There was an Italian restaurant called Del Soma, which was terrific. And the chorus kids went to Joe Allen's. Joe Allen's is still there. And people went to Sardi's. And also there was a restaurant called, there's a steakhouse, Wally's.
I thought you were going with Jack Dempsey's.
No. Nobody ate at Jack Dempsey's. That was from Guys and Dolls, you know.
Just because I went there once.
They had cheesecake at Jack Dempsey's. That's where the Guys and Dolls comes from. Yes, there was a lot of camaraderie, and you could go. There was a Spanish restaurant called Fornos on 52nd Street that Zero Mostel would eat in, and you could go to various places if you were alone, and you could have dinner with 17 people that you knew. It was good. It was fun.
Is there any particular special memory or fondest memory from the Polish Teahouse?
The one you remember, wherever Zero Mostel ate, there was always hysteria. I mean, he would get up and scream. And, but there were places down on Second Avenue that he did that too. Moskowitz and Lupowitz on Second Avenue. The guy that ran it was Anzelowitz. I'm not making these names up. Those were the real people.
Yeah. And Zelowitz, he had changed his name for show business?
No, he changed his name to Ansel. Other people changed their name. The subsequent generations changed their name. But the guy that, the father of Ansel was Anzelowitz.
Yeah.
And he ran Moskowitz and Lubowitz. I know that sounds like a routine, but it isn't. It's absolutely a fact.
Sounds like a Yiddish version of Who's on First. Getting back to the Yiddish, you were connected to a show in 1991. Those Were the Days.
Yes. Those were the days those were the days where it was Yiddish songs, Yiddish sketches, Yiddish vaudeville. And it ran. I was just helpful.
Right.
The guy who produced it needed some help, so we gave him some money, and we also arranged a few things.
Got a couple of Tony
Nice.
nominations. Yeah. Did you find that more and more along the way that people would start coming to you and say, "Can you come over and just check this out? We're in rehearsals. See what you think."
You try to avoid that. Those were the days I knew some of the people. Minna Bern was in it. Minna Bern was to be in Unser Camp in Kinderwelt. She was married to Ben Bonus. There's names that come out of nowhere. And they were performers. And they were friends of my Uncle Wolf also. So since I had some influence, we were helpful.
We're going to try and get a couple more questions in from the audience. Deborah asks, Manny, are the Hirschfelds behind you?
But we have a couple of originals, but those are copies. That's is Gypsy,
Mm-hmm.
Jerome Robbins, Broadway, and my wife was a dancer, and those are Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, Gene Kelly, Sid Charisse, Debbie Reynolds, and somebody else. And who's the other?
Rogers and Astaire and Gene Kelly. Could you get any good dancers on there?
No. So but we have a few that are. We have 2 or 3 originals.
Another question, any young and up-and-coming producers you're fond of who we should look out for?
Well, they're not young. Yeah, there are a couple of a kid named Mike Bosner who did Beautiful, and Orrin Wolf, who did what's the Egyptian play? The Band's Visit.
Right.
And the established ones are Kevin McCullum and Jeffrey Seller. I had something to do with the beginning of their career.
Hmm.
Jeffrey and Kevin did Rent, and Kevin and Jeffrey did Avenue Q, and they're established as they're the establishment on Broadway now.
Before we wrap up with a couple of final questions, I want to remind people that you have a chance. We're doing this tonight for the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene, and you have a chance to donate on screen to the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene. Obviously, a lot of cultural institutions in New York are suffering right now because of Corona, and this is your chance to just do a little something for the theater, and would be most appreciated. You mentioned a name earlier, Mike Nichols, who I had never had the pleasure of meeting or interviewing, but found endlessly fascinating. Is there a favorite Mike Nichols story?
Well, his real name is Igor Michal Pashkovsky.
Mm-hmm.
How's that for a story?
It's pretty good.
father was from, I think his mother was Austrian. I think his father was from Siberia.
Mhm.
And he got out of Berlin right before and right on time before the Nazis. And his brother at the funeral, at Mike's, the service, not the funeral, we had a little bit of a celebration, said that when they first arrived, either in Chicago or New York, and they passed by a Jewish bookstore with Jewish letters. And Mike was what, 8 or 9, 10, 9 years old. And he said to his brother, they allow that here? And that is indicative of what Mike's life experience was. He escaped the Nazis.
Mhm.
And it lived with him forever. He never ran away from it.
Paulie writes, let's see, I hope I got this correct. Paulie writes, what do you think the connection is between Jewish life and the theater? Why do so many Jews pursue a creative life in the theater?
It's an interesting question. I can only answer it. I was in Moscow for State Department, talking to theater people from all over Russia about how Broadway works, because it's a commercial theater as opposed to government-sponsored theater. And we got into a conversation which is similar. And I said that Richard Rodgers' real name was Rogozhinsky, and his father was named Rogozhinsky, came from Russia. Mike Nichols' name is Peshkovsky. Jerome Robbins' name is Rabinovich. George Gershwin is Gershovich, and Irving Berlin is Bialin. And they're all Jews from Russia. And they are the American musical theater.
Mhm.
So it was one place that had no restrictions. The entertainment business in America, both on Broadway and in Hollywood, did not have limitations. When I came out of the Army, there were places I could not live because I was Jewish, and there were jobs I couldn't have. But the entertainment business was available. So there's a disproportion. There are probably thousands of other reasons, but that's at least one of them. I think that we Jews should take pride in it, but don't get too excessive.
What would excessive be?
Intolerance.
Mhm.
It's the one wonderful thing about theater and maybe the entertainment business in general is that it doesn't have bigotry.
Mhm.
And when you get too proprietary, you're violating a rule.
I'll end this conversation as we ended an interview I did with you about 10 years ago, in which you quoted a line from The Real Thing, one of your shows, and I hazard a guess, one of your favorite shows, about happiness.
Happiness is equilibrium. Shift your weight. You see the bullet coming, you just move a little to this side and the bullet goes over your shoulder. If you're rigid and stubborn and you stand there, it hits you right in the head.
You still shifting your weight?
Shift your weight.
Manny, it's been a pleasure.
See you soon.
Could do this for a couple of hours and get into every single game for the 1969-70 Knicks season, but that probably wouldn't be appropriate for tonight.
I think everybody should watch you when you do the 92nd Street Y with Frazier and Bradley.
Okay, I'll take that Sunday night.
Non-Jews.
Manny Azenberg.
Well, can I get off now? I can go?
Thank you to the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene. And please, once again, there's a chance to donate to the theater. And we hope you've enjoyed this tonight. I know I certainly have. Manny, as
See you
always.
soon. Be well.